So most of you probably already know Sonia. For those who don't, she's been the face of television journalism on NDTV for a few decades now, or one of the faces, I should say. And what you won't know is, at least from my perspective, probably one of the most courteous writers of emails and courteous persons in person. So from being the face of NDTV for all these years, Sonia is now part of the Cambridge clan, so she's a visiting fellow at the CambridgeJudge Business School. Among the many things she's doing is understanding the changing role of media, the business model of media. And I believe your paper is due and Chairdeep is waiting for it on Monday. No one got the joke, but so that's Sonia Singh for you. Today we're going to talk about India and global politics. So I dive straight in and ask you a really open-ended question. What do you see from observing what's happening, but also interviewing so many people, both locally and globally, as the evolution of India's role in global politics?
Thank you, Marvin, and thank you for that very kind introduction. I think perhaps what sums up India's role in global politics today is the fact that just 2 months ago, I interviewed the Ukraine foreign minister in New Delhi, who had come to personally ask the foreign minister to attend the recent Switzerland Peace Summit. Why I would say that is because just a year before that, Ukraine had attacked India for taking Russian oil, saying that the blood of Ukraine soldiers is in every barrel you buy. I asked him why he changed his stand. And he said, the reason I've changed it is because I realized that India today is in a position to be a global mediator. I mean, he didn't say this, but clearly between the lines was the fact that it's all very well to align with the West. But in today's geopolitics, you need somebody who can talk to both sides. And I think India is uniquely positioned to play that role. In fact, very recently what's come out has been that the visit of the National Security Advisor Ajit Doval to Israel in March this year, just months before the Indian elections, was to look at presenting a Gaza ceasefire during Ramadan. Now, India today has not just the moral heft, but the geopolitical heft to be able to talk to the heads of state of both sides. We are no longer observers, but we wish to be active participants in the global geopolitical churn that is happening. And in that churn, especially for India, the concerns with the China, Russia, Iran axis is to make sure that our relations with Russia, old relations, also take a modern turn to make sure that they are an ally, depending on the situation with China. I've been here the last week and have been actually astounded to see that a US congressional delegation headed by the chairman of Foreign Affairs, the Congress Committee, and with Nancy Pelosi, the ex-US speaker, has been able to meet the Dalai Lama in India, speak very openly against President Xi Jinping of China. So India, immediately as the Modi government has gone into the third term, is taking some very strong geopolitical moves and really taking the gambit into its own hands. And I think that is the India we're going to see in the next 5 years.
So you talked about two things there. One is the proactiveness of strategy, but you also talked about churn and turn. And so is there also any other factors which change this? So how important is the economy, for example, and access to Indian markets and us being more open in the global markets? And how big of a factor is that?
I think the initial, and especially after COVID, I think India wanting to position itself as a China alternative. But I think that we have now perhaps graduated from saying that rather than a China alternative, we want to be looked at on our own terms. And what are those terms? That yes, we have huge markets, there is huge potential, but we also want to look at our global positioning as in a way to increase domestic prosperity. And we realize that if you have a vision, or the current government's vision is of Viksit Bharat by 2047, or even to begin the transition from a poor country, from a developing to developed, the first role has to be in raising per capita income. That's not going to happen without large-scale private investment, which will have to be driven in many ways by foreign investment. So in that sense, I think the opening up of India and reforms will be key to that transition. But I think what we need to talk about, and especially since this is in the context of recent election results, I think the democratic legitimacy India's elections and governments have is something which is a very, very valuable international currency India has today. It's not the ruble, we are the dollar in terms of that. And I think especially when we see now how the world has changed in terms of it's no longer West-oriented, or perhaps I would say a Western perspective. So when we look at that, which are the other countries which have a government which is elected for a third term? The other leaders, you'll have Erdogan in Turkey, you'll have Putin in Russia, you'll have Xi Jinping in China, who have a third term. But to be a democratically elected government for a third term of a country of 1.4 billion people, and of course, and the results have, I think, shown how alive and vibrant democracy is in India, because everyone's claimed victory, but the fact remains we have a stable government and a stable opposition. And I think that in itself, as I speak today, we are hosting Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina of Bangladesh in India, who had an election without an opposition. So I think that is extremely important. Our democratic currency is alive, thriving, and non-Western. So I think all those really position India uniquely.
Can you talk a little more about soft power, hard power, and how do you see that playing out? How do we use soft power? How do we use hard power? And if you had a crystal ball looking 20 years in the future, I won't say 50, or let's say 20, 10, even 10, how do you see that playing out?
I think soft power is absolutely useless if you don't have hard power. So I think, we used to talk up India a lot at a time when we were quite happy with what was called a Hindu rate of growth, but okay, at least India is known for its philosophy. I think we now do have to realize that it's ultimately hard power comes from being a country which is economically stable, which has the ability to lift people out of poverty. And I think that focus is there. It can come to different ways, but I think India's politicians do realize that it's a very, very tough road ahead because, just because of the aspirations and our population. But I think that soft power, of course, is something which can go hand in hand, but it cannot, one can't replace the other. It has to be together. But of course, it's wonderful, for instance, to look at, I think, the values and the philosophies of the Indian civilization. Being a global export is fantastic. It's now Bollywood and cricket as well, as we saw in the US. So those are all things I think we're all very proud about.
I love a good meme. I love a good meme. So let's go back to churn and turn and flip it in terms of, the churn and turn was a good reflection of what's happening globally and how that might, by default, shape India's position. So when you think about what's happening in the world and how that might change India's ability to be, a certain actor on the world stage and geopolitics, what are the different conditions in the future, not now, which might change that churn and turn phenomenon that you talk about? So,
I think the main point, and that is, in some ways, COVID drove home the fact that however much you close your borders, we are impacted by not just neighbors, but by what's happening across the world. So I think globally, we have seen that how, whether it's a virus or whether it's a war, how that can travel very, very, very fast, the impact. So for instance, the Ukraine-Russia war, the impact it had globally on economies. So I think the world and India cannot afford war at this point. And that, of course, would be the biggest threat to what we're talking about right now, not just Indian geopolitical stability, but global stability. And I think that the major players are very aware of that. However, what I do think is what would be the Indian government's top priority is to look at reforming multilateral organizations. And I think they are really, the UN Security Council is now only a Security Council in name. It has been discredited. We've seen what's happened in Ukraine, Russia, what's happening in Palestine. And it is a body which urgently needs reform or it will perish, as we've seen in history over the years. So I think the G20 summit, I think, was interesting in the context of looking at bringing together different countries. And I think really that India's role as being a negotiator of equal power came out quite evidently in that, where you had Russia and Western countries in the same table and signing on a dotted line. So I think that will be key, because I think really most powers recognize that whether it's China, Taiwan, whether it's Israel, Palestine, whether it's Iran, the potential for war is much closer than we thought, and that's what we need to ensure does not happen.
In a scenario where wars disappear and we don't have conflict, do we, on a large scale like we've seen recently, do we still be a dominant player in that environment?
I think perhaps our outreach to the global south is looking at redefining those rules of engagement where it was, where you would talk first of after the Cold War, then a unipolar world, where, say, America was the dominant power. Now you're seeing China, really, its emergence, and the return of Russia in a sense. So you will need India by reaching out to the African Union, by reaching out to the Arab Gulf, which has been a very interesting transition as well, and the global south. I think you will see that emerge as an alternative power center or pole, just in terms of population. I mean, the global south is where it's growing. Europe and the West are dying. So we do need to look at those numbers. I think the scale of population and the dominance will come from the global south in the years to come.
One last question before we throw it open to the House, and sticking with churn, turn, and adding transition, how are our leaders seeing the transition, A, from fossil fuels, but also the impact of climate and nature and biodiversity impacts on the country? I mean, the heat wave, I think, a couple of people refer to the fact that the elections, the biggest wave was the heat wave. And it may not be, that it was an isolated phenomenon. So how are we thinking of our place in a world that's turning and churning from the ravages of climate change?
I mean, I think what India has tried in the last years, not just 10, but the years before that, has laid the path for establishing India models in many things. So, for instance, our vaccine diplomacy. I think we're looking at no longer being, when we talk about soft power, that only countries which export yoga and Bollywood, but also looking at where we are at the forefront of, say, technology. So, for instance, the DPI, Digital Public Infrastructure Model, which again is completely different to the West, where data has been seen as very much corporate-owned or corporatized. And whereas in India, data is now seen almost as public infrastructure. It's the cheapest data in the world. It's brought from the most unbanked country in the world. I think we now have over the Jan Dhan accounts are 50% women headed, as in women's names. So I think we're looking at women-led development and digital development as our pathway to the future, not just for us, but as a model we export to the world. And I hope that's how we deal with climate change is going to be one of the models which can be India created, because frankly, Western solutions don't work for Indian problems. We've seen that we leapfrogged from not being able to get a phone for months when you applied for a land connection to the mobile revolution. So I think it's time for us to look at revolutions in exactly these areas you mentioned, just because it's also about the economy. I mean, I know from personal experience that agriculture has completely changed in India with crops because of the climate impact, and that means people don't get money in their pockets. And that means angry voters, which I think no politicians would want. So hopefully we're going to see a rapid revolution in that as well.
Okay. On that happy note, I'm going to throw open the floor for questions. Do we have any questions?
Hi, I'm Raga, and my question is more on the terms of over the last decade with emerging power like China and disengaged US with India. When we look into India, how do you think, and do you think India would play a smart role in playing the tug of war between protecting its national interest at the same time being an active player in the global order in the next decade? And if you think so, yes, how do you think it is going to happen?
It's interesting you use the word disengaged US, because actually I think the US-India relationship has been strongest from after the Indo-US nuclear deal. This is the strongest time. And why I'm saying that, because you see that the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, was just in India, again, literally a week after the results, talking about the latest technology collaboration. Now that I think the India-US relationship, perhaps to combat China, which is rising as well, or a common threat. So I think the India-US relationship is opening up in areas we never had before. Remember, scientists in India were actually banned, in a sense, after Pokhran from any kind of share of American technology, etc. And that to now see space as a major area of collaboration between India and the US and technology are really, I think, frontiers which haven't been explored before. with America and India because of security concerns. So I think India is a trustworthy ally. And I made that point earlier about democracy. I just want to elaborate on a bit. Look at our neighborhood. Who are India's neighbors? You don't have one actual vibrant democracy there. We have Afghanistan. We have Pakistan, where it's controlled by the army. You have Sri Lanka, where, again, it's a democracy in name, but not in Bangladesh. So in our neighborhood, India is actually the only global model of democracy that is not just functioning, but, as I said, flourishing. So I think that is something which the West believes, if they want to spread liberal democracy across the world, not their version, is something where it is a natural ally. So I think that is where you will see bridges being built a lot over the next years. China, of course, remains a very real problem. India has made this move in Modi 3.0. As I said, this Dalai Lama and the meeting with the US congressional delegation, the Taiwan president reaching out to Prime Minister Modi and his response are all opening moves in this round. So let's see what the next move is.
Next question.
Sorry, can I just go ahead? Hello, my name is Tejaswini. I work in policy and research. Thank you so much for your insights. I'm just going to circle back to that topic on soft power, and moreover, specifically on narrative building. So we see that there are a lot of these global media platforms, Al Jazeera, BBC, Guardian, New York Times, where the countries are kind of driving a global narrative from their perspective. I think that gives a lot of credibility, and it also drives not only leadership. I agree that leadership is looking more at India right now, but public perception and perspective. So do you think that there is a way, or should Indian media be doing more to establish themselves on a global platform so that there is active narrative building instead of simply hoping that people understand our perspectives?
See, I think when media plays a role in narrative building, I think the problem is a loss of credibility. And I think you found that that is an issue that is debated extensively in India as well. So I don't think that should be the Indian media's role as such. I think even with Al Jazeera, it worked when it came across as a perspective, or say an Arab perspective, but when it comes across as a government perspective, and that's a thin line, it does diminish its credibility. So I think that's a very important nuance, which we must take into account if we're looking at narrative building. I think, frankly, narrative building works when you see results or evidence on the ground. So, of course, and I think the Indian media has managed to present a very different image of India to the world than earlier. But I do think we can do much more, because right now we're all very, very focused on what's happening domestically. I don't think we pay enough focus to what's happening globally and geopolitically, because that really is where, I used to say as an editor, that's where the headline is. And I think that really is going to be the headline. It's not going to be so much of domestic concerns. We are globally much more interconnected than ever before today. And I agree with you that I think the Indian media needs to shift its focus outwards rather than inwards as it is.
Just a counterintuitive follow-up to that, because we do have time with Q&A. Is there a risk that we overdo the external focus? And I'm reminded by Dr. Hamid's session in the morning, where he talked about India is such a large part of the global population, and we should just focus a lot locally. I'm not saying completely insular, but where's that balance, and do you see their balance, and do you have some thoughts on that?
No, absolutely. In fact, I feel very strongly that a quest for Western validation is absolutely now defunct. It may have perhaps happened earlier, or I think that is now defunct. We need to look for validation which works for India and works for Indian challenges and looks at Indian opportunities. But I do think we need to be alive that what happens in the rest of the world impacts us in many ways. And so whether it's the rise in, say, global commodity prices, whether it's looking at, say, what you're the business guy, what's happening in the American markets impacts the stock market holders in India. But also I think that we cannot isolate ourselves in a Russia or China way. So I think we need to be very much active and engaged parts of a global community, but our focus needs to be very much what India needs and what India's demands are.
And it's a fine balance, I guess.
And I think, that point we made, that, the point of being a globally relevant geopolitical power is to make India a developed country. That's what our focus needs to be.
Next question. Someone who hasn't asked a question, you on the front. Can you give him a mic?
I'd love a glass of water if possible, just a glass actually, the water's here. Yeah.
But get a fresh one.
Yeah, I think the glass is used, yeah. Just a fresh glass is fine.
Yeah, hi ma'am, my name is Rohan. So my question basically is that since the topic is India and global politics, and circling back to the question about credibility of the media. So what do you think now, like, it's no, like, I won't sound political if I say that obviously the media was slightly biased to one side when it comes to the country. So what do you think can change from now? Like, you know, now that India is a stronger democracy and like looking at it from a global perspective also, like, you know, we are just saying the time that we wanted a validation from the West was completely, is not there, is not existent now. But, you know, you're calling maybe 40 to 50 countries as just the collective West. So it's not a very small point, a small, you know, area where we're saying it's, we don't need that validation. And even if you look at the Indian media, the questions that they ask from not a political sense to any party, they're really softball questions. You don't have data. So how do you see it changing going forward?
So I think on the Indian media, I can have another talk. I'm very much a part of it. I'm very proud of the Indian media. I think it's a very vibrant. When I began in journalism, we had only the government broadcaster. You weren't allowed to broadcast news live. And today we have over 400 news channels, of which there are the good, the bad, and the ugly. I think what's key to it is the authenticity and credibility of the Indian media. I think in some ways, we have perhaps lost our connect. I mean, what always astounds me is that, like in the recent state elections, all the predictions said one thing, and the actual results were different. Even if you would take this election, all the polls say one thing, the actual results are different. Now, we can't get away with this every time. I mean, at some point, people are going to ask questions. You've got journalists out on the ground. You've got people, why are we not getting evidence-based reporting or research or investigation? It is something that is a challenge the Indian media is facing. One of the major challenges is looking at reinventing really our whole model. I think what's been interesting is that you're seeing that last time maybe it was defined as a WhatsApp election. This time YouTube played a major role. Yeah. So I think we have to redefine also Indian media. It's no longer what you watch on television or read in your newspaper. So I think those are challenges we have to face. How the media addresses it is crucial for it to regain credibility. And I think that is really a key challenge that all of us in the media have to look at.
One last question to earn our lunch. Gentleman with a laptop.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sonia, for that really interesting discussion. My question is, we're in the middle of an election here in the UK. India's obviously just had its election. In India's case, it was clear that the politicians, the narrative they wanted to put across was not the narrative that the electorate actually delivered. I suspect that may be a similar result here. How do politicians actually connect with their electorate and listen to what they actually want?
That's a question you'll have to ask them. But I think the most successful politicians in communicating are those who keep it in a sense local. You don't necessarily have to do like large surveys or rely on what's being told to you by the channels or by newspapers. You need to be able to be grounded in a sense, to be looking at what, say, the local newspaper seller is talking about. If you go to what the original Chai Pe Charcha was, really people sitting around tea shops in the morning. I think really politicians are the ones who spend time there and see what they're talking about, are actually the politicians who have their ear to the ground. And I think you've seen that. I think it's a hugely aspirational India now. I think you've seen that there are very few politicians, they're the exceptions, who manage to retain their seats term after term after term, and that's gone much less. You've seen politicians are also in some cases getting younger. People want change. People want delivery. And I think the politicians who realize that are the ones who are successful. So I think, of course, the Prime Minister has been known for reinventing himself many times. So it'll be interesting to see what the Prime Minister Modi will be in this government. But I think he is really probably the most astute politician we have currently in India. So let's see how that plays out. I'm looking forward to the next 5 years. And the UK elections are interesting, and France coming as well. So, but I hope you know that the size and scale is something like our municipal elections in India. So it's, and I'm not necessarily looking at that too much.
On that happy note, that's the end of this session. Quick giving away of mementos before we break for lunch.